Welcome back to the channel. I'm Michael Neuenschwander with Outlook Wealth Advisors. In today's video, we're actually taking a question that came in from one of our subscribers, but it's a question we get pretty often. So his case, he was asking, I'm 61, I've got $1 million saved in my portfolio. Can I go ahead and retire now? And so as we go through today, we want to give you a little bit of a framework to say for some of you, maybe it's not 61, maybe it's 62 or 64 or 60. So we want to go through some framework and say, what are the things you need to know to be able to answer this question? So first, we're going to take some of the basic facts. If you're thinking about retiring and say, well, I've got X dollars saved and I want to retire now, or I want to retire in 2 years, one of the big things to think about is, well, is there one or is there two of you? I mean, are you married? Are you single? What kind of income is going to be coming in? Do you have pensions? Are you both going to have Social Security? Some combination of the two. So you begin to think about, what are your resources coming in? And you also got to think about your major goals. Are you looking to then leave a legacy? Are there kids, loved ones, grandkids you want to leave things behind? Or it says, no, we really just want to plan for the two of us. The game plan is to bounce that proverbial check on the way out the door. But some of the major considerations. So let's look at this. At 61, you're too early for Social Security even, and you're definitely too early to get on Medicare. So do you have a plan for how you're going to address that medical insurance or that medical coverage in between? And then for a lot of people, even if you can address the short-term issues of, well, yeah, we can bridge the gap. Maybe if you're lucky, you've got retiree medical. Maybe you've got COBRA that you can apply for 18 months, and then you've got to get medical insurance. But what about the long-term care side? That's the part of insurance and medical expense that typically normal, regular insurance does not address. So when we begin to put these kind of questions together and say, what is it going to look like, or can you retire, at age 61? Well, the other most important or key question in all of this is, what does retirement actually look like for you? Meaning, what are your hobbies? Where do you want to live? What kind of expenses are you going to face? Because once you know that, you can then begin to work backwards and say, how do you fill that income gap? If in this case, if this gentleman wanted to have $100,000 still to live on, but Social Security, if he started at 62, was really only going to account for about 40,000 of that. Obviously, if you waited, as we'll touch on in other videos, if you waited and said, well, take it at full retirement age, wait all the way till 70, and in this case, he's also married, so we talk about the issues of planning for a spouse. If one spouse starts Social Security, how does that impact the other spouse? Are they going to get a reduced benefit? Or when you look at health, longevity, does one spouse starting early, leave the surviving spouse potentially at a disadvantage? So it sort of becomes a little bit of the math problem, but you've got to address, not just the investments and making the money last, but how do you cover some of the major issues like that pre-retiree medical? As we'll touch on in another video, though, the pre-retiree medical can cost anywhere from $2,000 a month if you need it, or depending on income, maybe as little as $300 or $400. So one of the major things when you're trying to put the pieces of your retirement puzzle together and addressing, can I really retire early? Where's the income going to come from? How do taxes apply? What resources do you have, i.e. Social Security, pensions? It's not just the question of looking at those individually, it's understanding the interaction between all of them so that you can truly have a plan that works. So in this particular case for this gentleman at age 61, he was fortunate. He worked with a company that actually was going to give him retiree medical. So one of the major companies, he'd been there long enough, so they still had to pay for it out of pocket. So for planning, you have to build in that extra expense up front, but it wasn't going to be as expensive as having to go to the exchange and go get insurance directly. Then you also take into account tax issues, so Roth conversions, things like that. And how do you hold your income level down to where you're not chewed up on taxes? So when we look at this kind of question, it really becomes a all-encompassing question, which unfortunately, we can't answer on a personal level here in a video, but we wanted to give you a little bit of a framework. So to recap, what are the major things you need to address when it comes to determining when can you retire or can you retire early? Yes, how much you have saved is a big part of it, but just as important, how much are you really going to spend? And then when do you have access to things like pensions, Social Security, and how do those changes, delaying or starting it early, impact your long-term result? So this is one of those you could certainly put it into the retirement calculator or get with a financial advisor and have them run some numbers to see what's really possible. And of course, don't forget about long-term care. Many people truly underestimate how long they're going to live and what that kind of expense may really cost. So if we walk through this example, let's say so if somebody 61, $1 million saved, we're going to make the assumption, like for many people, that $1 million is largely in an IRA account. And like we said, they'll have resources. So at 62, they could start Social Security and he'd receive around $2,500 a month. Obviously, if you waited till 67 or 70, it would be significantly more. In this case as well, the couple is married. And if they're close to the same age, well, if one starts at 62, the other could start at 62 as well. Between spouses, the general rule, as you may already know or we've touched on, is that one spouse is going to receive either their full benefit or half of their spouse's, whichever of those two is greater. Now, when we say half, of course, if you're starting at 62, you still have to adjust it down. You'll get roughly a 70% reduction versus if you were waiting till full retirement age. But if one spouse is going to be claiming on the other's record, in many cases, starting it early and having two checks come in actually pays off versus receiving nothing. So running the math in this particular case, both of them starting it early, they were actually going to receive around $4,000 a month, for Social Security. So not quite half of the $100,000 of their goal. So that leaves them roughly needing to take out around $50,000 to $60,000 per year. So we got to tie that back to the investments. At $1 million, say, well, I need to withdraw roughly $50,000 to $60,000. If you're purely invested in sort of the traditional 60-40 portfolio and you go back to those rules of a 4% withdrawal rate, says, well, at $1 million, that's only $40,000. And that's not accounting for obviously taxes and inflation, because hopefully if you're retiring at 61, you're going to live a long life, but you may have 25, 30 years or more in retirement. So you've got to plan for inflation over that length of time. So in this case, the traditional portfolio maybe is going to make things a little tight. I mean, it's a little uncomfortable. Now, one of the advantages we have today, interest rates are still higher than over the last 20, 25 years. So there is some opportunity for some higher withdrawal rate. And that really comes down to portfolio strategy. So you've got to not just have the plan for retiring and what you've got to spend. You got to have the plan for what timing makes sense on Social Security and how to maximize that in your overall retirement, not just the biggest check. But then you've also got to have the investment strategy to make sure, can the investments really sustain the type of income you need? Now, this couple did not have an additional pension. But if you're fortunate enough to have a pension from a company, from the government, etc., then that may change your equation, your answer a bit. But in this case, they did not. And so ultimately, when we took all those factors into account and then had to say we need a plan for long-term care. Now, in a separate video, we'll go through all the different choices of what's available for long-term care. But at $1 million, we could say self-insure is not really one of the options on the table. When they're going to be needing to withdraw $50,000, $60,000 a year for retirement, the likelihood that there's going to be enough to, in the future, pay for what could be $5,000, $7,000, $9,000 a month, and that's in today's price. If long-term care were to come up, self-insure is not an option for this particular couple, so they then also have to address the expense of adding in some long-term care protection, whether that be via a life insurance, a long-term care policy, or some hybrid form of an annuity or something like that. But that's also one of the major considerations when you're considering retiring early. And then as we started off, one final consideration in their case was, did they want to leave a legacy? Did they want to leave anything behind to kids, oftentimes grandkids? Sometimes they skip the kids. But in their case as well, that wasn't a major concern. They felt like a lot of the families we work with that they had helped the kids get educated up and on their own, and so retirement was really for them. If there happened to be some left, sure, they wanted to make sure that they had an estate plan that was going to send that in an efficient manner to their loved ones. But the two of them holding back to simply leave more for the kids was not part of the game plan. So as we went through all the numbers for this particular couple and said, at 61, Could they really retire? And on $1 million with needing $100,000 a year for income plus some inflation and taxes, and not having any other pension or any other sources of income coming in, the honest answer was it wouldn't be a good decision in this particular case. They needed to either work a little farther or needed to trim the income. Not necessarily the answer they wanted to hear, but part of our job as a fiduciary is to give the honest answer. And so those are the major things we think couples need to consider as they're looking and saying, can we really afford to retire, particularly if you're retiring prior to 65 or 66, where you've got to address higher costs for medical, and if you take Social Security, it being a reduced amount as well. So once again, glad that he asked this question, but we really wanted to share this with everybody so that you can begin to have your own framework. Say, if you're thinking about retiring early, you've got to make sure you take all these factors into account and that you're looking at things for the long run and saying, is this truly a plan that works? Or are you stretching things to the point where it says everything has to go perfect in order for this picture of retirement? And being the background, being a CPA, being a certified financial planner, I tend to recommend things on the more conservative approach. So if it's a stretch that says you have to have the market work perfectly, you can't get sick, you both have to live a long time in order for that retirement plan to work, is there simply too much risk on the table that perhaps working 1 or 2 more years longer takes all that extra pressure off your overall financial situation? So once again, if you have questions like this or you're in a situation like this, make sure you subscribe to our channel. At the same time, also, if you'd like to get personal information, feel free to send us a message or reach out. Once again, I'm Michael Neuenschwander with Outlook Wealth Advisors. Thank you for joining us on today's video.